and now high-level continental initiatives that are happening, policy frameworks, blueprints, guidelines at the multilateral level in the context of Africa, and really highlight some of the challenges around realizing some of the benefits that go with AI, and also, of course, managing some of the known harms that are associated with that and that really impact very unevenly between countries and also within countries, with the most marginalized actually being most negatively impacted by AI, primarily through exclusion, because they're simply invisible in many of the data sets, or they are the subject of automated decisions that are made, AI-based automated decisions that are made, in which their experiences, their data is really not reflected. And then, of course, these systemic biases that are now in AI, which is essentially, a majority world and US driven innovation, particularly when we're talking about generative AI. So I think we kind of focusing a lot on AI. As I said, there's the UN Common Agenda, which identified digitalization and the inequalities around digitalization as one of the major challenges facing us when we were during the pandemic, and then of course in the post-pandemic economic reconstruction. And so the UN Secretary General has called for a global digital compact that would reorder the information and communication in global environment, and that would redress the growing inequalities that we saw, and the inability of the majority of the world, certainly the majority of Africans, to mitigate the public health and the economic challenges associated with the pandemic, because they simply weren't able to meaningfully digitally substitute for their work, for schooling, for accessing various social relief, public health warnings, etc., etc. Even though you will see South Africa has relatively high internet access compared to many other African countries, there's still a good 30-40% during the pandemic were not connected to the internet. And of the 50-60% that were connected, barely half of those are really sort of meaningfully connected. That is, they've got always on high speed, quality bandwidth that allows them to have multiple devices, have children schooling and do work, and kind of really be able to digitally substitute in the ways that many parts of the global north, or many people within the global north, were able to do. And so he called for this global digital compact, which was endorsed by member states at the Summit of the Future. And the Pact of the Future that came out of it has two components to it. The one is on the Global Digital Compact, the one's on digitalization, and the other is on climate change. And the UN Secretary General had identified these two areas as what he called these kind of seismic shifts that were happening on a kind of planetary scale. And the governance of these would depend whether we were going to mitigate poverty and inequality, or whether we were going to exacerbate it. And the trend was towards exacerbating it. So the compact of the digital compact is meant to provide a new vision, new instruments at a global level, and global solidarity funding to redress some of these inequalities. So important is it seen. And so, of course, it's also come up very much within the G20, which I think many of you would know, has had 3 years now of emerging economy leadership, and of course moves, that's Indonesia, India, and Brazil. And it currently is moving to South Africa, very excitingly, I think, but rather nerve-wrackingly, because this is a lot of focus on us. And within the G20, there's, of course, this digital economy working group that's been really elevated because of the global discussions around the importance of digitization and the essential ness of it in daily life. So really within this context, there's been a lot of focus on AI. I have spoken in other forums that you were at previously, some of you were at previously, about some of the negative impacts on the digital equality agenda and the funding of digital equality, and even sort of basic data statistics that we need as an evidence base to inform our AI policy, data policy, and of course our more basic digital ICT type policies. But nevertheless, the Global Digital Compact does reference, has got considerable focus on AI. One of the very controversial negotiating points was the financial commitments from member states, and of course from big member states, towards a AI fund that would support AI, kind of solidarity fund, although it wasn't called that, the bigger one was, to support AI development. And our very fabulous and very respected ambassador, permanent representative to the UN, Ambassador Marta Giorini, was very central to keeping some of those clauses in that the final version that was agreed to. But what these documents do, although the AI for governing AI for humanity document certainly goes a lot further, and we'll look at what it does do beyond the kind of leading global AI guidelines, such as the OECD principles or the UNESCO AI ethics frameworks, is it certainly goes further, and we'll look at what it does do. It acknowledges these inequalities. But I think that the main message for this is a lot of these guidelines that we've got now at the continental level, national level, all speak about these challenges that we've failed to address for 30, 40 years of reform now. But nobody says how we're going to address them. And insofar as organizations such as the International Telecommunications Union, or the World Bank, or many of these development agencies, they're speaking about the same solutions to addressing these problems that we fail to address. And really at the heart of it is this wicked policy problem of the digital inequality paradox. And as I said, I've spoken a little bit about this with some of you before, but I think it's really important to understand that it just shifts and it evolves with the technology. And in fact, it just gets worse with the technology unless you address some of these underlying issues. So the problem is that with these increasingly advanced technologies simply being overlaid over existing digital inequalities, which we know themselves are a reflection of deeper structural inequality. So if you look at global indices on, digitalization or internet penetration or, network readiness, e-commerce, e-government, etc., all of these, basically, the indices look like any GDP per capita indice. So the countries that least, wealth, resources, institutional endowments, etc., at the bottom, the least developed countries at the bottom, and so we go up. And there are, of course, some very successful, policy-driven, more positive outcomes like South Korea or some of the East Asian states, some of the Latin American states. Colombia made some progress, but broadly they remain within these broad categories. So, as I said, we know that digital equality is already a problem of structural inequality, but we also know that during COVID, digital inequality compounded these inequalities because people were unable to digitally substitute, as I mentioned. And so many people are, many countries are actually worse off, even, a couple of years now after the pandemic. But the problem is that, if we just layer these inequalities over existing inequalities, they simply become amplified. So when we begin to, look at, broadband inequality, and we see that, there are people online able to access the internet and those who aren't, and then we look at value-added services on top, and we look at people's demand-side constraints, and they can't actually even if they've got access to the internet, they can't use it. They don't have the educational or digital skills to use it. And then we look at, data, cloud server, all of these things. It becomes narrower and narrower and narrower, the people who are able to use them. And of course, more importantly, or equally importantly, the people who are producing them are smaller and smaller. So that by the time you're looking at AI, you've really just got, 5 big companies globally that own, own about or have about 90% of the value of, of the AI market. So these are really sort of, very wicked foundational problems that we have with policy that we have to address. And as I said, the issue as we go, as the technology evolves, is that it's not only as it was with voice services or text services. So we knew that as you bring people online, then you're actually increasing inequality until everybody's online, or online or has access to a voice, a telephone, because those who have access to the telephone are able to have all sorts of economic advantages that the people aren't. But as you get people online, but there are all these other network effects and value associated with being online, and you're unable to use them, we don't only have inequality between those online and offline, but we also have inequality between those who are barely online, eking out, with a tiny bit of short, small value data, couple of phone calls or internet or something a day, compared to people who are, using it daily to improve their own well-being by, reducing their transaction costs and doing various things, not having to queue in government departments. And then you've got people, of course, who are producing this and able to contribute to the wealth of nations. And so very often when we look through these policies, you're going to see here, there's very little about that links these digital inequality, this need for data to actually understand this inequality with what is happening at the AI level. There's questions around data and that, but it's about big data sets for AI and machine learning development. But actually the digital inequality is what perpetuates these historical injustices that we see in AI and advanced digital technologies through, as I mentioned, the invisibility. Simply people aren't in the data, the misrepresentation and the discrimination. And this is particularly of African and African descent people in these advanced digital technologies that are not only voice and that is already in effect, but not only text, but voice, and of course visual, facial recognition, these kinds of things that have particularly biased or discriminatory effects, because the data that's being used to build them simply, African people by and large are not reflected in them. So just to support this, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, I'm going to move to AI quite quickly, but just to speak about some of these problems, because the attention that's given to them in various of these AI reports is that we've got to have better, digital infrastructure. We've got to get more people onto the internet, and then they, digitized and they come up in the data better. But I just want to emphasize, because there's a number of projects and it's going to come up in our own G20 agenda as well, is that vast parts of the continent, certainly 2, but we don't even count 2 because it's not proper broadband, but 3G, large parts of the continent, Rwanda, Uganda, some of the countries that with very low penetration rates, Lesotho, have that level plus, so 90 plus, 99, 95, Rwanda, level of broadband coverage. And yet they have these very, very low levels of internet penetration. I'll show you in a minute. So if you look here, South Africa's obviously got a lot more 4G and 5G than many of the other countries, so we're well placed with that. But those 30% of people that are not online in our data, you'll see, have access to this broadband, but they simply can't afford it. They don't have the education. They're unaware of the benefits or how to use it. And that's the same for all of the people, all the people in these countries with very much lower penetration rates that you'll see. So when we look at internet access, for example, we see, South Africa's gone up to 75% now, and it looks very good. But when you unpack this and you look at the, half of the 75% who are using these services, they're using them absolutely minimally. When we look at mobile internet, smart device access, we see even amongst lower groups, and certainly in our micro enterprise service survey, a number of our micro enterprise informal sector have access to a smartphone. Not a lot, not the majority, but a lot of them do. But they're unable to use it for the internet. They may use it for WhatsApp, but they're certainly not using it for the business procurement or making appointments or even some of the most basic things. So, as I said, and also, when you get to these higher levels, and South Africa's always had relatively good internet access by gender, especially compared to rural, although we look very much at gender disparities. Rural disparities are even greater if you're comparing those, but obviously looking at these from an intersectional point of view, once you put gender over the geographic location, then the people who are most marginalized are obviously rural women. But men in rural areas may have actually less access, and do in the case of South Africa, than urban women, for example. What they do with it after that is then very important. So generally, men and women of a similar income and education access the internet and use it, but not for the same things, but use it in the same quantity with the same intensity, etc., etc. And if you break down in certain categories, you actually find more women at universities use the internet than men, for example. But if you look at the informal sector, there's parity. Men and women are in the informal sector, that's the lowest income groups, have equal access to the internet. But as soon as we move into use, the women fall behind very quickly. They either don't have the income through their businesses, or they don't have the skills. They've been taken out of school, or they've born children, or whatever it is, that they don't have actually the same level of skill, even though they have access to the device. So these are some of the really big challenges. Unless we address this, we don't get equitable, just AI that can be deployed in the public sector successfully, digital public infrastructures that are, being the data that from these is being used to run effective digital public infrastructures, which of course is another big area. And this is just another very quick example for you to show how these underpinnings of effective digital public infrastructures, that is the big issue that the presidency announced with the Troika leadership of Brazil and India, who had raised this, and then of course also the Brazilians, was that's going to be a focus of this presidency as well. And the necessary infrastructure, that is your broadband infrastructure, your data infrastructure, then your digital identification. We can't do anything unless online, unless we've got people digitally ID'd with unique identifiers. And then of course, on top of that, financial inclusion, financial digital payments, etc. So I didn't put these all up because we haven't got enough time, but just to show you again, just as this one example. So when you actually look at people, in the survey who have official form of identification, South Africa has always performed, reasonably well on that. When we, and it's interesting to see when we delve into this a bit more, what kind of COVID effects had on some of these things and why people haven't, got IDs or whatever it is. But when we look at the poor population with digital ID, South Africa really doesn't perform very well. So Ghana's doing a number of very interesting things, and they've had a lot of bank money and stuff to drive an effective program. Nigeria actually started long ago, and they've had several kind of false starts in this massive country and very problematic. But South Africa's digital ID, and that basically is our smart ID. It's not even a proper integrated, fully, biometric ID that Ghana and Nigeria are doing. We perform very poorly. So this is really kind of at some of the heart of our, of our service delivery, online service delivery solutions that we're looking at. So I just wanted to frame that, because we're now going to go with the rest of the world to the hype of AI, and I think we just want to keep in the back of our minds, the issues that we are going to face in Africa and the issues that we are going to face in South Africa, because our challenges, we've got lots of extraordinary data scientists doing exciting things. We've got a lot of capacity in the private sector and in the public sector too. But there are institutional challenges there. There are challenges around developing a successful, a digital public infrastructure, and the deployment of AI, right across that, and with some depth within organizations. I think we heard, how it's already quite widely used in SARS, for example. But, maybe it's needed there and it does it efficiently, and that's much more easier to use than, where it would be very, very effective, which would, home affairs or health. And I know there's also deployment in health. But I just wanted to also start by just asking, what is AI? Because I think a lot of us talk about AI, and when I speak to people about AI, it's not really what AI is. So I just thought if we could just spend a minute, and if we could just get maybe just in the chat, even if we can't manage that, just to get people to say, just off the top of your head, what do you understand by AI? Precious, can you just see if anybody has got any hands up?
And no hands yet. Okay. Colleagues, you are welcome to raise your hands or type on the chat.
Or maybe, Precious, you can pick on some people you know.
Okay, let's see who we've got here.
Who's going to be brave?
Colleagues, anyone, what is AI? I mean, it's a common word, lately. So I've got Ansi, who's saying someone else is using my voice, and I was going to pick you, Ansi.
I'm wondering what Benjamin, who's our IT guru, thinks about what he thinks. How would he describe AI?
Yeah. Benji, can we hear from you?
I don't have anything to say about that right now.
Benji, what a cop-out. Okay, we don't have to, the point I'm trying to make is that, AI is many things. And so it's really important when we're thinking about the governance of AI, the deployment of AI, and how we're going to use it, what we're talking about. So I think it's important, and I'll just speak through a few points, but there are many we could actually spend time on here. But I think the first thing just to say is that, AI has been used for a long time. You've probably become more aware of it now. But, whether you're on a Google or, an Apple technology or something, you're more than likely already, anything that's tracking you has already been using, AI for a long time, and it's got more and more sophisticated, and it's able to not only track you now, it can sort of prompt you and nudge you into doing things and buying things that you probably don't need. So AI has, been around, and it doesn't really matter, if we're talking about, machine learning, or, language modeling, ML. It doesn't matter if it's just to understand what the actual, regulatory, the data aspects of these might be, and what kind of regulation you're talking about. So a lot of the frameworks that we're looking at are looking at limiting harms associated with AI. And a lot of those are focusing very much on data privacy and, of course, on security. And, AI security is not old cybersecurity. This is very much more complex. If we think sort of magnitudes of scale on all of this, and complexity is just, so much greater. So absolutely security and privacy and data protection is absolutely critical, because this data is just proliferating. It's just being replicated. Now we've got synthetic data that's actually perpetuating the biases that were in the original data that it's been presented from. So there are a number of what I would call our traditional negative harm regulation, where we basically set up some rules and then you are obliged to comply with them. So in South Africa, we have an information regulator, and the information regulator can put certain demands, and she will, of compliance on government to comply with the POPI Act. and on businesses in South Africa to comply with the POPI Act. It's far more difficult for her to enforce those with big tech, with big platforms. Although when they have presence in the country and they want to be cooperative, we can do that. Not many African countries can, but we do have big tech reps in our country. And then, of course, there's a lot happening at a global level that's trying to manage big tech. But as a general purpose technology, when we speak about it as a general purpose technology, and this is important because AI is not a sectoral thing. At the moment, we've got AI policies in the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies, out of the ICT and kind of AI for Fourth Industrial Revolution Council, that kind of track. And then we've got AI coming out of NACI and Science and Innovation, which is very much looking at the kind of innovation side of it. And then, of course, there are various components in what's happening within the presidency that's got, an AI lens on it too. But the important thing is that, we know already it's cutting across everything. It's not a public sector or a private sector. It might be driven by the private sector currently and by private sector outside of this country and continent, but it cuts across everything. So a general purpose technology is a technology that affects firms, people, governments, business, across sectors. It cuts entirely across the economy and, of course, society. So that's what makes AI general purpose technology. Internet, a general purpose technology, right across, it cut right across society, very famously, like, electricity. Nothing else kind of operates unless you've got the electricity underpinnings of that. So that's a general purpose technology. Then we've got AI for distribution. And AI for AI with distribution, and I'm talking from a regulatory perspective, is where we're trying to control what big tech is doing. When we talk about AI and managing the distribution, it's what we are getting as data subjects and as users at the end of our platform. So how Google is engaging with us, because they basically it's the distribution part of it. They've got the AI production side, which stands behind that. And obviously, we have local firms with AI production, doing AI production in agriculture and health and financial. And our financial AI is very, very sophisticated already. But that's where a lot of the international responsible and ethical AI frameworks have come from. And I think the part of the problem with some of these frameworks is that there isn't this distinction between what are we trying to address from the AI distribution point of view, which is what, for example, UNESCO's guidance on platform regulation, which is extensively about AI, is about. It's about getting guidelines for big tech platforms to regulate their engagement with people, with citizens, with data subjects in a particular way. On the other side of that, we've got the AI production. So, ethics by design is part of the kind of discourse of that type of regulation. But this regulation is actually, obviously important as a base for the rise of generative AI. But generative AI, these foundational models have present completely different challenges around regulation. And so while they are very useful to SARS, who are communicating in English, who have quite a good body of data around taxation and the intricacies of collecting that and distributing that. If you are trying to use a generative AI, even in a francophone country, but certainly a lusophone country, certainly if you're trying to use it as a indigenous language speaker, anywhere in Africa, or if you're sitting in, Lusiki and you trying to find out about, some local history or something, you'll find a lot if you're just looking for information on Madiba, but probably not if you're looking for some less internationally well-known person who's been written about in English. So these are actually what are creating these kind of much greater inequalities. But anyway, let's just keep those in mind. So we've got all these inequality issues, and then we've also got these different kinds of AI. And I'm just going to run through now some of the formative international AI governance initiatives and the global governance initiatives that are been emerging very rapidly in the last year, to demonstrate the kind of epistemic influence of this. So the way that these the values, the normative values that are in these documents are carried through into regional documents and into continental and national documents, our own documents as well. And as I say, some of them just seem like motherhood and apple pie and quite normative. But what I want you to think about when we're looking at these is, how is this going to redress what we spoke about, that is uneven impacts, those uneven impacts that we see with harms associated with AI? And do they actually address the issues of the uneven distribution of opportunities, most importantly, because we want to grow our economies and benefit from this as well? And so here, if we look at the AI principles, we see that there's inclusive growth, there's sustainable development and well-being, human rights and democratic values. And then these earlier ones, went from really big issues of growth, sustainability, well-being, human rights, democratic values, to transparency and explainability, which is really around algorithmic governance, robust security, so robust and secure and safe, broader digital, but quite narrowly AI kind of governance, and then accountability. And again, that's accountability of the tech on the institutions on the one hand, of course, accountability of institutions that may be regulating them on the other. And so the OECD was in 2019 or so, I think just before COVID or at the very start of COVID. And then the recommendations were really around fostering an inclusive AI enabling ecosystem. So important, so that can't just do the AI, it's not just technology, it's the ecosystem. Investing in AI research and development, we actually don't know a lot about what is happening with it. It's kind of all in the black box. Shaping and enabling interoperable governance and policy environment for AI, building human capacity, which has been a big thing and come up in the Global Digital Compact and the AI for Humanity. Preparing labor markets for transformation. So the future of work has been a big focus. A lot of the research coming out of the OECD, coming out of the World Economic Forum, very different impacts that it has in a less industrialized country on the African continent. Investing in AI, research and development, I've actually said that. And then importantly, international cooperation for trustworthy AI. So very early on, and it comes out of the data governance and the data economy work, is that you don't get the flows of information that are ideal or best for markets to work. You don't get people online. People aren't going to do financial transactions. They're not going to use AI applications if they don't feel that it's safe and secure. But I think what didn't come out of the original work, and it comes out very strongly, for example, in the Africa Union data policy framework, as an underpinning for AI, is that it's not just about safety and security. It's actually about broader issues of legitimacy. So if citizens trust a state that might not fill various other criteria, but they feel like their data is going to be used either benignly or for the public interest or something, then people are going to feel like it's a trusted environment that they can participate in. When we worked on the UNESCO platform guidance, there was a lot of which basically argued for greater regulation of big tech. There was a lot of pushback from many countries, civil society in many countries with repressive states, who said it would simply be used as a rubber stamp to enforce surveillance and negative things. So people were saying, well, at least with big tech, we kind of know what we're dealing with, and they're using our data to commercially extract stuff, but at least we're not going to land up in jail or dead or something. So the trust part of it in terms of political legitimacy, and that is a very important part that in many of these frameworks, because they've got to be signed off by lots of member states, aren't there. And so you increasingly got this focus on a responsible and ethical framework for artificial intelligence. And I must just say, and this is a very short cap of a lot of work and literature that's been done on this, but this responsible and ethical AI framework powerfully, very, very powerfully influenced by the big tech lobby. The notion of responsibility goes with a long self-regulation discourse and practice, going right back to media, old style media and various things where, you want to control freedom of expression. And in this case, you want to control, you don't want to control freedom of expression, and you don't want to control innovation or inhibit innovation. You need to just require that people check the boxes on ethics, and then, it's good to go. Then we can put it out. So as the African Just AI project at Research ICT Africa, we've written up quite a lot of this, and we've done a lot of work with the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence under a project which I should have a slide on coming up, on data justice, and looking at that as the basis for Just AI, which really requires that you do a lot more than have a responsible and ethical AI framework. It's that you've got to proactively engage in economic regulation to ensure those opportunities, to ensure access to data, etc. But the UNESCO framework is, again, significant. The OECD kind of set the ground. It's been adopted by all OECD countries and a number of others as well. The UNESCO recommendations were important because they actually got sign off on this document from the UN, which we didn't with the platform guidance, by the way. So member states have all signed off on this. And as I said, very clear normative framework, and then a lot more, getting down to the AI governance issues around the principles. So those are, I think, a bit more developed and more conceptual clarity around them from the OECD. And then they've got an AI readiness methodology, which looks not only at kind of, a production AI ethical design kind of side of it, but also looks at social, cultural aspects, scientific, economic, technology, and infrastructure. And there is actually a UNESCO AI readiness methodology, a RAMS study that's been done for South Africa that's actually under review, and it should be out next year. Of course, it's taken time and the whole landscape's changed, but that will be out. I just want to say, in looking at these, it looks at the kind of more traditional legal, human rights, institutional, scientific and innovation research. At the economic level, it's basically, it's not an economic transformation model. It's about efficiencies and productivity and improvement. And in those ways, maybe doesn't go far enough for the African continent. And so I think it's just important to think in terms of those. And of course, then there've been, a number of others that have emerged from that. And we've had, a whole lot of AI safety issues that came out. Of course, we've got the AI Act in the EU, which is a far more horizontal act. It actually regulates AI across the economy and society, and particularly the markets. We've had the Biden declarations on AI safety. We've got the Hiroshima declaration from the UN last year in Kyoto. So there are a number of initiatives that have come up. But this, I think, is just a very telling graph that comes from the Governing AI for Humanity. That's the report that I mentioned, came out together with the Global Digital Compact from the UN Tech Envoy. So the Office of the Secretary General, the UN Tech Envoy, brought out the Governing for Humanity report that it didn't go in the same way as the Global Digital Compact to UNGA, but it was put out as the UN's position on this, and it's now been canvassed further. But basically what they highlight here is the lack of representation outside of the UN for AI governance initiatives. They look at the OECD AI principles. They look at the G20 AI principles in 2019. That I think that must have been Saudi Arabia, but might have been Indonesia. Council of Europe AI Convention, the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, the Ministerial Declaration that I mentioned, very much a responsibility and ethics framework other than that data justice work I mentioned, the G7 Minister's Statement, and so on. So Minister's Declaration. And basically you can see that, for the G7, you've got G7 plus a few countries, 118 countries are not party to any of the samples that are given here. And so the AI for Humanity report is calling for 7 principles. Sorry, I know what happened there. That come from the high-level advisory panel, of which we have wonderful South African representation, Professor Emma from University of Pretoria. But basically they're looking at a scientific panel on AI, importantly a policy dialogue for AI governance, because a lot of the things are around standards and interoperability and transparency and explainability, but actually not clear on what that policy context, what that policy environment needs to look like. So these are the 7 that they propose, and they basically base it on this AI governance ecosystem that they are proposing that the UN be this kind of connector or coordinate these. And they're looking at the work of the International Scientific Panel, looking at coordinating GPAY, OECD, and various national and regional initiatives, and then a governance dialogue coming out of the AI Summit, the Group of 20, which is South Africa's presidency, of course, this coming year. So very significant for us. And the South African government has said there will be a special task force on AI, regional organizations, and so on. And then, of course, very importantly, this AI data governance framework, which in this AI for Humanity is acknowledged as this critical underpinning of, at least with the data governance right, some of the other things fall into place, but importantly, capacity development and an AI global fund. Before I finish this international section or go on to the next section, are there any questions around the global environment?
Dr. Alison,
Yes.
there are no questions on the chat, but I do have some colleagues who are responding to your previous question about what is AI.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Should we hear them?
Yes, I've got Tim who's saying it's a computer actions that mimic human decision making based on learned experiences and data. I also have Tapelo saying AI is artificial intelligence. It is currently used by corporations to code and other mechanisms.
Okay.
That's what I've got for now.
Great. So, I mean, before we carry on, just interestingly, so, when we talk about compute or computing power to mimic human behavior, of course, it's not just regular compute. So we're talking about, well, at its most extreme kind of quantum computing, but, hypercomputing that's able to process these, millions and millions of trillions of pieces of data, in a second. And then it's not just to, mimic behavior, of course, which, some other computing and machine learning can do, but it's actually to mimic intelligence. So it's also to, it's one of the distinctions is that it's, and it very controversially claims, that it's actually sentient, that it can kind of create knowledge and things is part of the debate. It's something that head of Google's claimed and has been shot down by some of our fantastic African data scientists as well, like Abebe Behani. But it's important to think about it as different from other computing systems that are able to replicate some forms of human behavior. So it's actually around intelligence and depending on how you find that. And then just to say, of course, there's coding in the process and there's a lot of things, but it's obviously way beyond coding. These are extremely complex models that are very difficult to make transparent, because in fact what a lot of data scientists are doing when the data is fed in, it's pretty much a black box. And so it's quite difficult to either to know what's coming, to know why what's come out the other end has come out like that or not, and particularly how to regulate it. But yeah, it's this, very much a higher order of compute emulating or acting as human intelligence. Okay, so we are running out of time, so I'm going to go. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to make a very quick comment, if you don't mind.
Of course.
One was when you asked the question, I went to ChatGPT and I asked ChatGPT a question. I said, "Can we trust you?" and ChatGPT said to me a very interesting thing. It says, "You can trust me to provide accurate, unbiased, and helpful information to the best of my ability, but always verify critical details and decisions." And this to me was so good, as I am a tool, not infallible. I think that's a powerful statement. And then maybe as you proceed, I wanted to make a comment just on the global issue. What I heard from you up to now, and I'm very interested to see how it plays out in the rest, is if I listen to how the developed world, and maybe represented by institutions like the OECD, what they're viewing as their priorities around AI and where they want to go, it seems to me that they're on a totally different track than where the developing world currently is. They are also making this gap much bigger between the developed world as well as the developing world in terms of where we are with AI, what we view as the most critical issues at this point. But I look forward to the rest of your presentation on this. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
So, Elaine, very interesting that it said that, because part of the self-regulatory thing quite early on was that you have to show that this product that's being produced, whether it's now in GPT, particularly with images and stuff, that they are that they're either watermarked or these kinds of things to show that they are AI. But in the very earliest parts of the regulation, it was that you have to ChatGPT in this case, other forms of AI, they have to tell you that what they're doing or what basis they're using for that. They obviously can't tell you all its sources because it's made out of a million things. So quite a lot of them, if you ask them those kind of questions, they've kind of been set up to answer those. But if you ask some things in other ways, it doesn't always say that. So I think the ones that have been very topical at the moment is you ask ChatGPT. It was probably around, probably saw it, I might have got it quite right, but you ask ChatGPT whether Palestinians are legitimately in Israel or whatever, and then you ask are Israelis legitimately in Israel, and they give two completely different answers. And the one is that Israelis or Jews are legitimately in Israel, and Palestine is very qualified. But that's because that's what the data that's collecting, and there's predominantly data that supports the idea of. But if you don't phrase it with like are you can I trust you for the question I'm answering or something like that, you're probably not going to get as overt a response like that. But yeah, as I said, there were efforts to try and do that, and I think some companies are doing very and more things like that, are doing some interesting work around making it as transparent as possible. Then to your second point is really where we get into, and we have to get to it rather hurriedly, is what's we doing different, and what are our needs, and what are what is AI in our context should look like, and what does it look like currently. And I think that you make an important point that we might be looking for different things. I think there are two kind of areas of this. There's one level at which like we're all in the same boat. We've all got this big tech that we don't have. So as I said to you before, that was around the companies that actually own it. But in terms of countries, about over 75% of the US, or 75% of AI market revenues are held by the US and by China. European Union, for example, all this, raft of legislations, the Data Act, the Digital Services Act, the AI Act, are all to gear its market, protect its market, from other players, protect its own innovators, and it's very strong on these, and protect its own markets, protect competition, etc., etc. And in that sense, there's a lot we can learn from them. I mean, if we can piggyback on their, coattails, there might be stuff that we can do because Meta's going to have to comply with Europe. I mean, they did this with GDPR. They basically rolled out GDPR because they were required to, in other markets in which they operated out of Europe, to do it. Which is the General Regulation on Data Protection, the initial EU Data Protection Act. So that part, I think we're all kind of in a similar position, and I think the global governance issues on that, we could have a much stronger voice than we have, and we could, try and extend some of those gains that have been made around access to data, localization of data to our own environments. But on the other hand, I think what we're trying to do with AI, that's where it kind of diverts for me. There's a diversion for me in the frameworks and things that are there that we simply take from even the UN, but from multilateral organizations that are using essentially the assumptions of mature markets, of democracies, of and other things. And they most of our countries, somewhere along the line, there will be a commitment to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, or growth, or poverty alleviation, or public service delivery, or something like that. Those are they'll come and they'll appear in certain sort of things, but they're not driving the AI agenda. The AI agenda there is very much around trying to get a foot in the door on innovation, trying to improve already reasonably high levels of public service. But I think what is interesting, and which we've been trying to draw out very strongly in our work, is the initial modeling, the regulation was really around notions of commercial value creation, and our experience of these data extractive systems that and as I said, therefore the focus just on harms that we didn't really have any control over, but that were that was resource allocation was around, we need to emulate commercial value creation. We need to also get platforms and these sorts of things. And of course there's an aspect of that there's a local relevant market that you can do that for. Unlike many of these countries that say they're going to be global leaders on AI, it's very unlikely you're going to compete in those international markets. So I think it deviates somewhat, and I think that's where we kind of need the reality check. We need to say, what are we doing with this? And so I think the work on public value creation, which really plays out in the economics on improving cost of service delivery, improving policy and planning and those kinds of things, has enormous value for us, and is not drawn out sufficiently at all in our emerging frameworks on the continent. So basically we have 10. So and I suppose the other thing just about the international and the national and the development banks and the multilateral organizations is that, like with the internet and previous telecom reform, the imperative has been to have an AI policy. It's not really, for a lot of countries, until you start that process, it's not really clear why you should have it or what you're doing it. And the other thing is that these are mostly being driven around either multilateral agendas in organization, or very strongly, and probably less or more concerningly, is around either big tech agendas or foundation grant agendas, which are often the big tech are the biggest ones on that. So everybody's the push was only if you wanted to be on the poster child of the World Bank or whatever, you had to have an AI policy. And so you can see Rwanda was one of the earlier countries to have a AI policy. It's got less than 20% internet penetration, but it's ticked all the other boxes for the World Bank, and you've got to have an AI policy. But until you address all those other problems, the AI policy, is going nowhere. That's not to say we don't have to keep it in mind, and we've got to, be thinking about how we're doing that and that, because it's not waiting for us, it's not stopping for us, and we can't sequentially, go. We'll never get there at the rate that we're going across Africa at the moment. But how are we going to use it? What we're going to prioritize? What we are going to fix at the same time so that we can benefit from it are very important questions. And then, of course, there are several countries that it's in development. Sorry, and then I just wanted to say, at the early stages, there was an initiative by our NEPAD, which was a AI white paper for artificial intelligence. It says for socioeconomic development, looking across sectors at AI, so agriculture, health, interesting paper, but not really an economic policy, which, by the way, and I think I probably in the end forgot to put the link, but maybe Alma's on the call and can put it in there. The African Just AI Project has got a economic policy for AI document. We're working across the continent, of course, so it's quite a kind of higher level document, but it's actually looking, when we get to the last slide, if we ever do, it's actually looking at application of AI in terms of, traditional, like state formation, revenue generation, so taxation, distribution, social welfare, social investments, and then the whole kind of sectoral gamut of things that you have as well. Then, of course, we had the Smart Africa Artificial Intelligence for Africa blueprint that has become the blueprint for a number of other countries. This was during South Africa's presidency. Smart Africa, of course, has a primarily private sector mandate, so it's around building private sector capacity on the continent, obviously very important. But you will see in the document that it preferences issues of property rights, of intellectual property. Of course, we do need legal frameworks, rule of law, and those kinds of things. Innovation, not too much regulation, those kinds of things. And that we carried through into our first South Africa report, but the latest policy has changed. So this is just from our website, and you can look at there. We're constantly updating it. These are the African countries without policies, these that are undergoing policies, and then those that do have policies. And there we're trying to kind of categorize them in terms of their agendas as well. And I'm going to go much faster through this because we just don't have time. But, if we look at the North Africa, Algeria, for example, quite a lot of focus on socioeconomic development, focus on sectoral application of AI to the sectors. So just going back to our OECD, EU kind of focus, and that obviously far more looking at very practically how it can assist with public delivery and public use, with not very much attention to, in most cases, very much attention to private sector regulation, or what we need to do at the global governance level to stop disinformation and disorder, or which AI is now kind of at the core of, because of its virality, scope, and speed with which things can happen. And will be focused for our G20, but it doesn't come up very strongly in many of these. And then if you look at some of the others, Benin, a leader in AI and big data. Okay, it's within West Africa, so it's a bit constrained. But currently, no data centers, or very few data centers. Very limited data science capacity within the country. Political instability, of course, and a number of things that really challenge, reaching that. Rwanda, as I said, very strongly the responsible and ethical AI framework that's kind of been, cut and paste there. And then again, to position itself as a global leader in AI innovation, I think it's, great to be aspirational, but I think, you want a policy to be, attached to reality in certain ways. And then Tunisia, as I said, North Africa, you tend to get more of the that focus. And then, of course, while the outer NEPAD was producing the white paper strategy, which did go on rather long, and kind of was happening in NEPAD and not in the AU, and the AU is probably responsible for policy, but the Science and Innovation and Technology Division unit in outer NEPAD actually got a mandate from the Ministers of Science and Innovation to look at that, and so they did. As I said, that was that document that's looking far more at kind of sectoral AI application. And then earlier this year, the African Union brought out the Continental Artificial Intelligence Strategy before the outer NEPAD one was kind of wrapped up or was in process. And this was sponsored by UNESCO, and so draws very strongly, when I say sponsored, politically sponsored by UNESCO, GIZ funded it. But it's basically, the responsible AI, the ethics, responsible and ethical AI framework of UNESCO. So, I mean, it's very useful, but basically it looks at, it doesn't really deal with some of the, it brings assumptions from markets that are more mature, countries with greater institutional endowments. So, it covers a lot of the areas like skills development, the building and capacities, as we mentioned, the minimizing risks, the private sector investment, and that's needed. In fact, this arm of UNESCO has OECD people in it, so it's got quite a strong economic influence on it, and then regional and international cooperation. But you can see here that the governance framework is obviously cross-cutting, but it's basically a harms framework, and arguably not sufficiently a harms and opportunities framework. So it does have maximizing the benefits, adopting it in the private sector, building a vibrant AI startup community, but it doesn't say how you're going to do that, how you're going to get adoption in the private sector, how are you going to get, sorry, I think I've gone on the slide. So that's really I think the challenge with it, and that's, of course, it's a challenge with our policy as well. We now have a new policy, and comments are due in today. So I hope that people have participated in this. It's certainly it's developed from the earlier version. It's at the moment a framework. It's quite open to whether it should be a policy and move towards an act. Very nicely, I think in this round we're beginning to get the AI as a driver of public value and economic growth, and obviously in the Government of National Unity's objectives. Human-centered AI that complements human capabilities, the human-centered AI very much from the OECD and UNESCO focus, and then of course also some inclusion of some of those UNESCO principles here as well. But I think interestingly is that it's talent development, digital infrastructure, research, development and innovation, public sector, fairness, ethical guidelines, privacy and data, transparency, explainability, fairness and mitigating. Privacy and data, definitely governance aspects to it, ethical AI guidelines for development, important. Fairness and mitigation, bias might have governance implications. But I think what's very interesting is that the actual governance and regulation focus comes quite far down towards the end of the document. And it's for a lot of these documents, because they come out of a self-regulatory framework, and as I said, this one very much from in its original iterations from the Smart Africa Blueprint, there's really not the creation of this enabling environment, this governance environment that you need in order for this to happen. Who's going to be responsible for talent? Who's going to be responsible for fairness and mitigating things, that sort of thing. So as I said, again, builds on 4IR. This is the one that's in the Department of Communications. It draws on the Global Digital Compact, though I would argue not sufficiently on the Governing AI for Humanity, very much on the AI ethics recommendations, on the Continental Strategy that arises from that, and the outer NEPAD white paper. And then the focus is on transforming socioeconomic challenges, enhancing human capabilities, addressing unemployment through technical innovation. And, I think some of those things are there, but I don't think we necessarily have grasped the nettle on, redressing this uneven distribution of opportunities and how we make that happen, greater participation in global governance, greater resourcing of local players, stronger enforcement of competition of local players from foreign competition. Then we have in South Africa a parallel process going on in NACI, which is the Innovation Council, and in the mandate of science and technology, multi-stakeholderism carried through from all the documents. Importantly, again, collaboration, research, future data infrastructure, strategic sectors, always at the end, trust and regulation. So I would just urge us to kind of have that framework. This is what we've got to have in place before we can do all the other stuff. Let's really focus on what's required there. And then they're looking at funding, capacity building, regulatory and legislative frameworks, and this is meant to be finished by February 2025. So I suppose just in the interests of time, but just to finish off, I just wanted to speak a little bit about what a just AI framework would look like. Sorry, it's very noisy going off on multiple devices. So I think the important thing is that we need to look at regulating AI across the entire value chain. And that will require, as I discussed earlier, looking at what we need to do even before we get to AI, distribution, production, things, but those would be some of the granularity that we need in AI. We need to look at AI in the total value chain if we're looking at getting a just and equitable AI policy, which starts really with mineral extraction. And I think fortunately that has come up in the G20 agenda, not in our digital agenda, but in other agendas, because of the massive amounts of rare minerals that are being required for AI development on the continent under extremely exploitative conditions, and no beneficiation here, those kinds of things, exploitative labor practices, and then of course the horrendously labor exploitative processes attached to labeling for AI, these big workhouses really, and also for content regulation for harmful content that is just hundreds of people just for that kind of work, particularly just psychologically very distressed in very considerable numbers. And then in the case of Kenya, some deal. So the Kenyan government actually regulated against certainly the content regulation side, but then Meta, in particular, the big tech, came back and provided some compensation, and so that protective legislation was actually withdrawn. So really important during these processes. Of course, big tech has its role and its place, but during these processes, it's really important to insulate the processes, get the countering multi-stakeholder positions for the country in place, and of course collaborate on the continental level so that we've got some strength and leverage to do this. As I said, one of the biggest challenges is concentration. This is a problem for countries across the world, except if you live in America or if you live in China, and then we know there's a whole lot of geopolitical instability around that too, so that creates other problems. But this, I think, is also something that has come up at the international level. As I said, we do participate in some of these output documents. We've got some specialists on like the AI high-level advisory panel, but a lot of this is happening in multi-stakeholder governance forums, or governance forums that allow multi-stakeholder action. Very strong influence from social movements, and really important that South Africa draws on the academics expertise, private sector expertise, of course, but civil society expertise that has been involved in a lot of the digital development and governance issues that we probably do less than we have in the past. And then the important point I wanted to make is, of course, we want to develop this framework for risk mitigation. So we want our framework for risk mitigation to move beyond simply sort of individualized notions of privacy, to looking at issues of exclusion and of course the bias and things that arise from that, but also economic regulation to actively redress the distribution of opportunities. And by that, I mean, creating opportunities for local data scientists to access data to innovate. And I think I mentioned at the last session, we've got a fantastic opportunity in South Africa. We've got one of the world famous local language modeling experts in Professor Vukosi Maravati at UP, working on local language modeling with all this data in the SABC in local languages that he's been unable to access to date. And we really need to be looking, we're still looking at our old siloed things, and we've got to support the public broadcast, we've got to do this, and we've got to do that. He's actually been trying to develop this. He has his own startup, but it's also for the government communication, GCIS, which is meant to be, doing this in all these languages, and does it in 3, maybe 4, from time to time. So these are things that we really can unlock. And then the other thing is we've got many of our policies, our African data policy framework is talking about, open data, open government, and the availability of this data being made preferentially early on to local researchers, local entrepreneurs, and innovators. And this is problematic because we've now signed, off on the African Continental Free Trade Area, basically a World Trade Organization type framework. In fact, parts of it exactly word for word. The digital protocols as they stand would currently prevent us from doing that kind of preferential national or African getting cross-border data flows at an international level preferentially. But that's what you have to do for redress. Simply creating a framework, a compliance framework for big tech does not redress, does not allow us to compete fairly. So we really need regulation for fair innovation, for public value creation, not just commercial value creation, though that's important, and regulation to protect our local industry and of course our citizens as well. So I don't have time to go into this, and I wouldn't point you to it, and I'll put some publications and things that I haven't got to here. But I think, we nearly, when we think about applications of AI, when we think about digital public infrastructures in the context of creating public value and about their application to, state theory and state delivery, but how we build public value that, improves the efficiency of the state, but also the equality of service and of service delivery and of planning and of thinking about what we can do to just redress these deep structural inequalities that we have. But we can then think about it in relation to revenue generation, in relation to distribution, in relation to social investment, into, as I said, we don't even have the basic data and public statistics that we need to make many of these decisions. So I'm just going to leave that. I'm just going to leave that there, and just take some questions, because I don't think we've got enough time if I go on for some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Alison. Any questions, colleagues? So maybe while we are waiting for the hands, let me just remind colleagues that today's webinar and all the webinars that GTech has delivered can be accessed on our Knowledge Hub and YouTube channel. There's a link on the chat. Please do visit the link. Also, I've attached a link for the survey, and we are kindly requesting you to take a minute and just rate your experience. I do have a hand from Elaine. Elaine, please come through.
Doctor, I just wanted to say, just in the interest of time, I would encourage, it's so rich what you presented on, and I encourage participants or people who attended, and even who will watch this later on, to share questions, queries with us, and we'll directly forward it to you. I'm sure you're happy to respond. And this is a field where you might get quite a few students who want to become more involved in the work you are doing, and so please let us know, and we will also let you know. And I for one, I thought, we only had time to touch on for example, the regulation of the AI value chain for social and economic justices, and there's so many issues there around exploitation of resources, labor, profit extraction, societal concerns, etc., etc. That in itself, I think, is such a rich topic because we are all benefiting from this, but very few of us understand where it, what this value chain, how our own people and the continent and other developing countries are being exploited. And what can be done and who is supposed to do something about it? Who should lead on this? And do we have actually, as a developing country, have a voice? Is there like a developing world construct around this which do give us a voice? Is the G20 the right place now coming up? Is BRICS the right place? But somewhere I think as the developing world, we should put a voice together, have one voice to speak about these issues, because country specifics, like you even said, use the example of Rwanda and others who have already developed, although their reach is very limited, they already have a policy framework because that's what the donors want. So we can't country by country try to take this on. We do need to speak with one voice, and it would be very interesting to know where and how we do this. But thank you just from my side as well. This has been incredibly rich and so interesting, and I'm sorry we couldn't even go in more depth. We might even want you to come back another time, but thank you so much, Dr. Gillwald. Appreciate Dr. Gillwald, over to you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. As I said, it's a lot on a Friday afternoon, so probably better to come back than have had an extended session. But just to say, in response to your, what can developing countries do? We have a completely historic moment. Probably once in many of our lifetimes, certainly once in the next 20 years, that South Africa is going to be leading the G20. And more importantly than that, in the context of the Troika leadership, particularly India, Brazil, and South Africa. But of course, a lot of those early inroads were made by Indonesia, just by expressing their positions. But I think the integrated digital agenda across the T20, but also the Digital Economy Working Group, is really a historic moment for us. And that is why I am so keen that we, really put out a bold AI policy, in the context of our presidency next year. And as I said, the presidency has announced a special, a task force, which is a special instrument within the G20, separate from the digital working groups and the other things, that will focus on AI. That we have, a really bold policy that addresses many of these gaps that I've been speaking about. That speaks, in the context of the African continent, which again the presidency and South Africa has committed itself to do during its presidency, and of course with the AU now an organizational member. So I would really urge people within government, speaking to people outside of government, draw on civil society who have been working very closely, for example, with our ambassador in New York on these big global governance shifts that are going on. World Summit Information Society, big chunks on AI there, besides the ones that I've mentioned today. So this is all happening now. It's happening next week in the first part of next year. So we're running out of time. Let's do this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alison. This has been very insightful. Colleagues, thank you for availing yourself and for staying a little bit more of our scheduled time. Since there are no questions, we are going to adjourn this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Precious. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gillwald.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Professor. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, colleagues.